Thanks. So now that we've seen the basic principles of certification and what are the main things you can find or can be different across different certification scheme, let's have a look at what the EUTR is saying. So I will first speak about, we will first have a look at what exactly are in the EUTR documents, official documents, and then we will talk about what are the conclusions and what's the outcome of that and how, therefore, you can include certification within the due diligence system. So let's have a look at the EUTR. So not like very quick reminder that the EU timber regulation main objective is to address the presence of illegal timber, and operators are under the obligation to conduct due diligence on all the timber products that they are placing on the EU market for the first time, or the UK market if you're listening from the United Kingdom. Several products are explicitly exempt from this process of due diligence, right? It is written down in the regulation that the regulation does not apply to any timber product which is covered by a FLEGT license or a CITES permit. And finally, there are specific products based on their custom codes that are exempt because they're not listed in the Annex 1, which is listed all products concerned by the regulations. So for instance, musical instruments might have a custom code that's not listed in the regulation. Therefore, the regulation does not apply to them. You don't have to conduct due diligence if you're an operator. Certification, certified products, is not under those cases where it's explicitly exempt. So certified timber products are not a green lane under the EUTR. What does it mean? It means that even if you have certified supplies, you need to include them within your due diligence system. It does not mean that it changes nothing. The certification can be taken into account as a tool which may considerably ease your due diligence process and lower the risk of illegality much easier. Okay, so really make the difference that you need to include certified products in your system, but the implementation of your system can be considerably eased by using certified material. That's just a slide just to remind you of all the official EUTR documents. We have the regulation itself. There's also an implementing regulations and further guidance documents, both from the EU Commission and from the FLEGT EUTR expert group. You can find all those documents on the European Commission website. You just have, it's a very long page, so you just need to scroll down a little bit until you reach the legislation and guidance pages. So I've made a few screenshots here of the regulation. I'm going to read them very quickly. Don't panic. We are going, after that, we're going to unpack this and group those elements and talk about them more slowly. But that's just to remind you of what's actually written down in the regulation that that you have to apply if you're an operator. So the regulation is talking about certification in Article 6, which is describing due diligence systems. It is saying that the due diligence systems of operators shall contain risk assessment procedures, and such procedures shall take into account relevant risk assessment criteria, which can include the assurance of compliance with applicable legislation, which in turn may include certification or other third-party verified schemes, which cover compliance with applicable legislation. So we will have a first instance where certification is clearly mentioned as a risk assessment criteria. The due diligence systems also must contain risk mitigation procedures, which may include requiring third-party verification. So here again, can be used as a risk mitigation. Then the implementing regulation is also talking about certification. And Article 4 is actually describing the criteria for certification and third-party verification scheme to be used. And it says that they may be taken into account in the risk assessment and risk mitigation procedures where they meet the following criteria. A publicly available system of requirements which shall at the least include all relevant requirements of the applicable legislation. B, appropriate checks, including field visits, made by a third party at regular intervals. C, means to trace timber harvested at any point in the supply chain. And D, controls to ensure that timber or timber products of a non-origin or timber products which have not been harvested in accordance with applicable legislation, which means illegal timber, do not enter the supply chain. Finally, the Commission Notice guidance documents, Section 6 is all about the role of third-party verification schemes in risk assessment and risk mitigation. It gives some background information. It's very wordy, so I'm not going to screenshot everything here, but you may have a look. It gives some background information for a certification, which might be interesting for you. It also reiterates things about the necessity to have legal coverage, the nature and frequency of audits, and the exclusion of unknown or illegal material. It also adds on to what is in the implementing regulation and the regulation itself. First, it's saying a few words about the need for third-party organizations and schemes to be qualified, to be compliant with international standards, and to be accredited and independent. Secondly, it insists on the checks that need to be conducted on portions of material coming from non-certified forests. And lastly, it is also insisting that documented shortcomings and problems within specific countries of operation of these schemes must be identified. Right, so don't panic. This is just a really quick overview of what's in the documents themselves. Let's now unpack this and group them into big families of criteria. So if you are intending to use a certification scheme within your DDS, it must follow 3 big groups of criteria. First, it needs to have a sufficient quality, and both for the system and for the checks conducted. Second, it needs to have some way of traceability and avoiding the risk of mixing with unknown or illegal material. And thirdly, it needs to have a sufficient legal coverage. So let's go through that one by one. So systems and checks qualities. The EUTR is saying 4 very important things. Publicly available requirement is a condition. Independent check, so third-party check by qualified organization. Regular checks, so not more than each 12 months. And finally, physical checks, so it should have mandatory field visits. And it's also saying in the guidance that you can refer to the fact that a scheme is compliant with either ISO or ISIL standards, which are basically should cover those 4 elements of requirements, checks, and checks. All right. Let me give you an example of a scheme that would be not okay, that would be completely outside those EUTR criteria. Because you might think that the main forest certification schemes that you know of, they're normally very close to that, or they're compliant with that. So I want to give you an example where it would not be the case. So we have, let's think about a fictive certification scheme that someone is launching that would be called Perfect Timber. That would not have standards available publicly. So it's not online, it's not anywhere, it's not public. Secondly, you know that the certification body, so the auditor, may be a sister company to the certificate holder, which is the auditee. You also know that audits are conducted every 6 years, and you know that those audits may be conducted 100% remotely. So here we'd have an example of a certification scheme that could exist legally. If companies find it useful, they can use it. It has the right to exist. However, it does not check the conditions of having publicly available requirements, independent checks, regular checks, and physical checks. So it does not comply with EUTR criteria to be used in a risk assessment or risk mitigation process. Okay, so that's the first thing, the strength of the system and of the checks conducted. Second thing, having traceability at any point of the supply chain, which means in the forest and when the timber is exiting the forest, through any entity taking legal possession of the material. And it's also linked to having sufficient control to avoid mixing, to avoid any mixing with material that's either illegally harvested or of unknown origin. And there's a specific point of attention for timber which is sourced from non-certified forest, which may in certain instances enter the supply chain. It's commonly referred as controlled material, and we'll get back to that a little bit more in detail. So traceability requirements is basically about asking, can the system properly ensure the traceability of certified material? Now, in the forestry certification schemes, this is usually dealt with a specific chain of custody standard, which is applying to entities along the supply chains, and it will basically describe rules on how those entities can handle the material. And you might have already heard or might use yourself different segregation processes, such as transfer system, mass balance system, or credit system. Those are all systems describing, based on the industry that you're in, how you can and will handle the material from the entry point in your plant or organization up to the exit point. There's no like pure traceability system in that there's no volume reconciliation of very systematic volume reconciliation in existing forest certification schemes, but that's something that has been discussed for a while, and it would be basically to also to have a systematic validation of all the volumes that a certified entity is selling and all the volumes that a certified entity is buying. So there are other ways, or it's a complex way of ensuring traceability. And basically, you need to keep in mind that the idea behind that is to also be able to detect false claims so entities claiming that a material is certified and selling it as such where it should not. And the second question of this big family is also asking how robust are the checks conducted on materials sourced from non-certified forests. So sometimes an entity can include timber from non-certified forest, and it normally shall have to assess the risks of illegality on this timber. So there are standards existing specifically dealing with how an entity shall conduct such checks on legality. And it's a process that's very similar to the EUTR due diligence that you're applying. Again, we'll come back to that. It can be quite confusing, but we'll try to unpack this. And those materials are basically called controlled material. And let me again give you two examples of that would not be compliant with the EUTR criteria. So let's say, again, we have this fictive certification scheme called Perfect Timber, and it only has one forest management standard in place. It means that the forests are audited, but once the logs exit the forest, there is no independent verification on how the timber is transformed and traded along supply chains. So here, this system, again, would have the right to exist, but it would not comply with the requirements of having traceability along the supply chain and control over unknown inputs. Okay. Another example, if we have this Wonder Timber different certification scheme, for which we know that timber processing entities can include timber from non-certified forest. And to do that, we know that they only have to obtain a self-declaration from their supplier, saying that the timber has been produced legally. Here, there is no sufficient checks on the legality of timber sourced from non-certified forest, right? It is too weak. It's not complying with the EUTR. So the final product, we cannot trust that all the timber included will have been harvested legally and will be of known origin. That's for the second part. Third part, legality coverage. So EUTR says that that certification schemes must include compliance with legality. That's the first point. So they must say that legal requirements must be respected by companies, but also that the definition of applicable legislation must be similar to the EUTR definition, at least. Now, that's just a quick reminder of what the applicable legislation means. So according to the EUTR, there are 5 big areas of legislation which should be covered and which are concerned by the regulation. They are, first, right to harvest with timber within legally gazetted boundaries. Second, payment for harvest rights and timber, including duties related to timber harvesting. Third, timber harvesting itself. Fourth, third parties' legal rights concerning use and tenure. And 5, trade and customs insofar as the forest sector is concerned. So again, let's do this little exercise with a fictive certification scheme, which would be called this time More Perfect Timber. Let's have a look at the forest or fictive forest management standard. And I just want to say this is a very rough and simplified example, but that's just to make you understand how the process of examining legal coverage should go. So we have a forest management standard that says the following. Criterion 1, the organization shall have legal rights to operate in the management unit, in the forest management unit. So based on this, I might consider that the first legal category, legal right to harvest, is complied with, is included, is covered. Criterion 2 says that the organization shall comply with the applicable national laws relating to harvesting activities. Okay, I think our third legal category, timber harvesting activities, is covered. Criterion 3 is reading, the organization shall recognize and uphold legal rights of local communities and indigenous people. To which I might say, okay, third party's right, I think that's covered too. And finally, we have a fourth criterion, which reads, the organization shall comply with applicable national laws relating to the transportation and trade of forest products. And I can say, okay, category 5, trade and transport covered. So here we can say that in our fictive case, it does not entirely cover the EUTR definition of applicable legislation. We have one legal category which is not included in the forest management standard. And this is what we can call a gap in the standard, right? What is the outcome of that? Well, the outcome of that is that for all the categories that are properly covered by the scheme, if the scheme is complying with all the other criteria, the quality criteria and traceability criteria we've talked about, then we can conclude low risk of illegality. If the scheme is functioning properly, it means that an auditor will annually verify that legal right to harvest, timber harvesting activities, third parties' right, trade and transport legal rules are implemented correctly by the organization that is being audited, right? So it is possible that we, out of those 5 categories, we're using the certification scheme, we're trusting it, and we can say, okay, low risk of illegality because I know that it covers the legal category, those legal categories. However, for taxes and fees, we know that it's not including it in the scheme, in the standard. So for this category, we shall have a closer look. How? Well, you'd need to do a regular risk assessment process, asking yourself, what is the legislation in place at the country of harvest concerning taxes and fees? Is this legislation in place consistently complied with? If you find out that at the country level or legal level, can be state level, the legislation in place is consistently complied with, there's not systematic non-compliance with these rules, you can also conclude the risk of illegality. However, if you're in a context where taxes and fees regulations are consistently non-complied with, then that's where you will have to use mitigation action, tailored mitigation action, to address this concern that would not be covered by the certification scheme. Okay, but remember that out of 5 legal categories, you only need to assess 1. So that's still like a huge gain of time. So that's just another way of visualizing this process. It's basically additional mitigation actions are required only if you detect a gap in the legal coverage of this set standard and the scheme, and in countries or regions where there's a risk of non-compliance, right? That means that those rules that are not covered by the schemes are at risk of not being complied with. It happens a lot, it happens often, it's not properly enforced, right? So that's the process of examining legal coverage and making sure that the certification scheme you're using is having the same definition than the EUTR one. Now, I just want to say a few words to conclude on that. The EUTR is listing 5 very broad categories of legislation. In the guidance, it also provides for a list of non-exhaustive examples. Now, the level of details just want to mention that the level of details can vary. Approaches can slightly differ between organizations. Just so you know, the main forest certification schemes you might be using and have in mind do include some elements on those 5 broad categories. That's for a start. And some organizations consider that as long as there's one element that falls within this category, that's fine. Some other organizations, among us ourselves, choose to further detail those categories for several reasons. First, to have a more comprehensive outlook, because those are very broad categories, and to be able to align assessment, be it country risk assessment or schemes assessment. So just as an example, Preferred by Nature has made a list of 21 subcategories out of those 5 big categories, but that's kind of our work. And just to give you an example, legal right to harvest have been split between land tenure and management rights, concession licenses, management and harvesting planning, and harvesting permits. And so if you want to assess legal coverage of those schemes using this list of subcategories, you might have a really much detailed and refined assessment and level of granularity of those schemes. So, but that's kind of an organizational approach. So just want to make that clear. Yeah. So now that we said the requirements of the EUTR, okay, how do we include certification properly within the due diligence system based on this? So basically, the steps would be the following. First, evaluate the certification schemes you want to be using and accept it formally as part of your due diligence system. That would be the first step. The second step would be to properly include the use of certification within your due diligence procedures. And that will have an impact on the 3 steps of due diligence. And finally, apply the due diligence procedures that you've written down and elaborated, and conduct appropriate checks on your individual certified supply chains. So let's have a look at that. So the first thing would be to take the decision to include a certification scheme within your due diligence system. And to do that, you need to make sure that you can justify that this certification scheme is compliant with the EUTR criteria in terms of system and checks qualities, in terms of traceability and avoidance of risk of mixing, in terms of legality coverage. And you must keep records that can be shown to a competent authority, explaining why you think that this certification scheme is compliant and is robust enough to be used. Right, so I'm aware that it's a very challenging analytical step ahead of using certification. I'm sure everyone just wants to use certification just like that. However, if you want to be compliant with the EUTR, you need to have this first analytical step, and you need to include it in your DDS and be able to justify why you're using it. Now, tools are available to help you do that, to help you justify why you think it's compliant with all the criteria I've just mentioned. So, first of all, you might find assessment frameworks. So that would be, if you want to do the assessment yourself, you might find tools to help you go through this assessment and walk you through it step by step. So Preferred by Nature has a generic system evaluation guidelines, but you can also find WWF also has an assessment tool, and the Dutch authorities, for instance, also have developed their own criteria to assess certification frameworks. So there's a few available elements out there if you want to conduct the assessment yourself. But you might also find different things, such as scheme owners' self-evaluation. So for instance, FSC and PFC have developed their own justification based on what I've just said. They've developed their own documentations to help you justify why they are compliant with the EUTR. And finally, you might also find third-party evaluations, so independent actors which have done the assessment of some certification schemes and have published it. So here are a few examples. So you're not alone in that, but you still need to do this process, this first step. Once you've done that, you need to include the use of those certification within all your procedures. And basically that will apply to both setting up the system, so writing down your procedures and improving them, developing them, but also to the implementation of your procedures. So I'm going to talk about access to information, risk assessment, and risk mitigation. I'm going to refer both to setting up of the system and actually implementing it. So first, let's talk about access to information. First thing to know and be aware of is that all the mandatory information to collect for each supply chain, there's still a requirement. So the requirement to know all the species in your products and all the countries of harvest of your products is still there. It does not go away because you're using a certified product. So that can be a bit of a challenge, but it's still there. You need to be able to identify all the countries of harvest, all the species, which means there's some amount of supply chain mapping which is necessary, even if you're buying complex products which are at the very end of the supply chain and have been processed by a high number of entities. You need to be able to say with confidence species and countries of harvest. Okay, you might be able to get help from the certification scheme itself. This is the example of the FSC certification scheme, which is making it a requirement in the COC standard for any certified organization to pass down information both on species and countries of harvest, right? And it's so if an organization, if you're requesting your supplier, a certified supplier, countries of harvest, information on countries of harvest and species, they are under the obligation to provide you with this information. Otherwise, they're not complying with the COC standard that they should be complying with. Okay, so that's one good thing to know, that you might rely on your certification scheme itself to request this information. Now, second group of information that you will need to gather and check is basically information about the certification system that you want to use that is applying to your products. So just recording that this product is FSC or PFC or OLB or something else. Verify the validity and scopes of certificates of all the suppliers that you've identified in your supply chain, and also verify that the product being traded is indeed covered by a certification claim. And we'll make a demonstration of that in our fourth and last presentation. Now, risk assessment, that's the main part. Use certification. You can use certification as a credible information that is indicating legal compliance. As I mentioned, if there's no gap in the legality coverage and all the other criteria are complied with, you can conclude no risk of illegality, because essentially there will be an auditor going on the field regularly that is qualified, that is independent, that is under a bunch of rules that will assess regularly on the field directly if the company is complying with the 5 big EUTR criteria, right? Now, if you've detected a gap in the legality coverage, you only need to assess this gap. So yes, it's annoying, but still remember that if you're conducting due diligence on uncertified products, if you're working in a country where there is a long list of risk of illegality, you will need to mitigate them one by one. So even if you're using a certification scheme where there's a gap, you only need to assess this one gap. It might save you a considerable amount of time, even if it does not save you all the time, and it's not automatic. So yes, you still need to do a bit of a process there, but it will save you a considerable amount of time to be compliant with the EUTR. And you can also use the fact that chain of custody systems, if they're compliant with the criteria, they are very efficient in ensuring low risk of mixing within supply chain entities, right? So there's a low risk of mixing with a non and illegal material if the chain of custody system is robust enough. So I just want to remind you a few things, just to help you visualize how certification it can be much more powerful than just doing due diligence system. And that's something you can include in your justification for using certified products and relying on it for your risk assessment. It's important to remember that certification is a conformance assessment, which is by nature more thorough than a risk-based assessment. You can visualize a conformance assessment such as certification this way. So basically, for all the entities down the supply chain, there will be a set of rules identified. Normally they cover legality. And for all the set of rules, there will be a third party coming, visiting this entity and running through the checklist, verifying that all the rules are complied with, right? And this will happen for all the entities down the supply chain. So basically, you have kind of a comprehensive check that is happening for each entity. It is happening with harmonized checklists. So if this third party is changing over the years, the checklist will still be the same. And these checks are happening in person and on the field. You can, however, visualize a risk-based assessment like that. So basically, a risk-based assessment would be more often the last entity of the supply chain, which will assess all the entity of the supply chain. And to do so, they will identify first which rules are likely to be breached, so which rules are under the risk of not being complied with, and they will make verification on those rules that are likely to be non-complied with. So basically here, in this instance, we have potential distance between the assessor and the entity that's being assessed first. Then the focus is selected, like not all the rules will be comprehensively checked one by one. You will only, like a risk-based approach is just focusing on where the risk is. And finally, the entry point of a risk-based approach is document-based and remote. Doesn't mean that field missions do not happen, but the entry point is really document-based and remote. So this process that's the EUTR process, basic process. It's efficient, but it just keep in mind that a certification process is more thorough, right? So if you can explain that the certification scheme is compliant with the EUTR criteria, it's much more efficient and reliable than just doing document-based assessment from a very distant perspective. Okay, so keep that in mind and be able and ready to explain this. And last but not least, and I'm going to end on that, you can use certification within your risk mitigation process. So basically that would be if you're having a non-certified material and you're having a non-conclusive risk initial assessment, so you're concluding non-negligible risk on this non-certified material, you can use certification as a way to get to a low risk of illegality conclusion, right? So you can either work with your suppliers along the chain so they get a CSU certification, and or if they already have one, identify new sources of certified material. You can also encourage forest management units to enter certification. That, I'm aware, is a long process and a complicated process. Keep in mind that also that certification is a demand-based mechanism, so demand is having an impact, normally having an impact on how many forests choose to enter forest certification. And that's just to conclude that it's not to be confused with using one-off independent audits for specific supply chains as a targeted risk mitigation process, right? So that's basically where certification should fit in your due diligence process and steps. I'm going to stop there. I think we have a small break